to get mine. I want to get mine. I got to get that, and then I got to nope, that's all. I don't know where I was going with that. Just different brainwave, yeah.
Welcome. You are entering a strange realm. A realm of what ifs. What if movies, television shows, and video games were better, worse, bizarrer, or downright different? What might they look like? Find out on today's episode of CineCasters.
Hello and welcome to CineCasters. This is the show where we watch movies, talk about them, disassemble them, and try and put them back together as something whole new and fresh and original. I am Nate Draper, and I'm joined as always by my very good friend, Janglez.
Yo, what up?
And today we are doing I'm trying to remember what year it was, but the film is
2001?
I think you're right. Yes.
Maybe 2002, but yeah, around there.
This is somewhere early 2000s. Christian Bale, Equilibrium.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd seen this before. I saw it when it first wow, sorry. My phone just went into voice activation mode. That was strange. We talk about like dystopian sci-fi.
Oh,
that was kind of weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're here. I saw this movie first. I think I saw it it was several years after it came out, but I remember it was a friend of mine who said that what he liked about it was like that they had kind of invented this fighting style for it. And I actually watching it this time, you have some thoughts about the fighting style.
Okay. I've never seen this movie before.
Okay.
And my first reaction, upon finishing it, was I think this was somebody watched the Matrix trilogy and was like, I want to do that, but not that. Because that's what this feels like. Like the sleek design aesthetics. Obviously, there's some other things playing into that, but some sleek design aesthetics that the way that the action tries to be super cool, still smart. Like the movie tries to be smart, and I think in some ways it does succeed. But then it also tries to have this action heavy oriented thing going on while still being smart. And the entire time I was like, somebody watched The Matrix and was like, I'm going to do my own Matrix. And in some ways it really worked, and in some ways it really didn't work. The idea of the gun kata, which is what they call it, the fighting style, is so stupid. It's so stupid. I would have been fine if they were just they train in martial arts and use guns at the same time, because that works. That's fine. Just leave it at that. But the fact that they had to explain it it's a logical thing, and this is the way that you can increase your proficiency.
Funny. Yeah.
So stupid. So stupid.
Watching it this time. I mean, I remember watching it the first time and being kind of like, oh, that was okay. I wasn't really blown away by it. And this time watching it, and there's so many points going I don't buy it. I'm not buying this. For example, one thing that I always I question this idea, and I don't think this is true, that it's emotion that causes, that our ability to feel emotion is what causes world war.
Oh no. You're giving away my pitch.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you look at if you read history, you realize anytime conflict is entered into, that actually, just to orchestrate that, actually involves a lot of people working together. It's not a impulsive thing. It's always a very conscious choice.
I think the idea is that they always is that they always talk about it's hatred, this hate or lack of compassion, and to some degree I can agree with that.
To some extent
does, but I think there's so much more to it, and I'm gonna go into it. In my pitch, but
there were a lot of things I definitely felt were just kind of laughable. But at the same time, I like what I called the 90s industrial rock music video aesthetics. Yeah. Which is basically, that's basically how I would describe how this movie looked. But there's something about that I actually find very appealing.
You mean that kind of like grayscale where everything is kind of tinged in this like super bloom, but it's gray. It's like very, yeah. It does feel like very like early 2000s or late 90s kind of like music video where everything was in widescreen because it was new and everything was like pristine and sort of grayish white because because the Matrix. Yeah,
maybe, yeah. But there's something about the aesthetic about that I like, and also like the brutalist architecture. I mean, that same kind of aesthetic existed in like iRobot, had a similar kind of look to it, a similar kind of a palette, I suppose. I don't know, that I actually do find that kind of appealing. And so I'll have to say, I think the way the movie looked, the way it was lit, the way it was shot, it had a certain polish to it that I appreciated. I know that we did say that the fighting style was kind of ridiculous.
The concept behind it was dumb, but the choreography is pretty tight.
I was gonna say, so yes, that's what I was just gonna say. I usually kind of check out during action scenes. I generally find action scenes incredibly boring.
Yeah, you said that before.
But I didn't in this case. I actually thought it was a pretty interesting way to stage a fight scene. That's about it. I
thought the choreography was pretty slick. My problem with the choreography is my problem with most choreography in movies is that the action happens quickly and it looks really cool, but the camera cuts so quickly that it's hard to see what the actual moves and actions are, because when you cut and move quickly, it makes it like look more bombastic. But I maintain that like the best fight scenes that I've seen are ones that are done with like almost no shaky cam and very few cuts, because then you get like all action, all choreography. And the best examples of this, I think, are the hallway fight scene from the second episode of Daredevil. In this first season is spectacular. And then the fight scene,
I would say the hallway scene in Old Boy to me is a great fight scene.
I haven't seen all of Old Boy yet.
Because I haven't seen Daredevil, but from what people have described to me, it sounds like it just rips off Old Boy.
Oh, well, there you go. Quite possibly.
I could be wrong. I haven't seen Daredevil, so don't take it from me. But there's a great scene in Old Boy, and it's just brutal. It's just this really long shot of this guy just trying to make his way down a hall, and these guys like trying to hack at each other, and it's very brutal, like, and it's discomfort. And the reason I like it is because it's uncomfortable to watch, and I feel like violence should be uncomfortable to watch.
Yeah. In Daredevil, it's less about it being uncomfortable to watch because he doesn't kill. But so what the effect of that is you just watch as these Russian gang members sort of just pile on him, and the entire time you can see and I wonder how much of it is acting. You can see Charlie Cox, the actor, is exhausted. And that comes through in his character, because he's like like every time he puts one down, another one comes through the doorway, and it's over and over and over again, and he just he gets up after flooring one and is like so tired, and it shows like the lengths that he's willing to go to make sure that he brings this kid home. This kid he doesn't know, but this innocent kid. It's great. The reason I bring that up is because that shaky cam thing is really, really where and you talk about like it's just brutal and violence should feel uncomfortable. I often thought that this movie was going to ask the question like, why are we killing senselessly? That's the point of taking the prosium, and it never quite gets there. Especially because the choreography is so tight and the killing is so almost systematic. Like boom, 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 boom. But we never really quite get there. And it's so close. So you can see like, oh, we're almost there. And somebody even asked the question, but we never like go into it. And I find that when I watch Daredevil, or my other favorite fight scene is from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It's the long fight scene between the two female leads. Because they're trying to figure each other out. There's a purpose to the fight scene. Neither of them really wants to win. They want to figure out, does the other one know my motivation? You know what I mean? There's like, it's like a chat, and you watch this happen on screen, and the fighting is great. But there's got to be a motivation to it. In this one, I often felt like the fight scene was just sort of like, let's have a gratuitous sort of action sequence, as opposed to, that isn't really meaningful, as opposed to, and that's usually like Christian Bale's character versus like 7 other guys, and it's like that's not really meaningful. The only fight I really felt was meaningful in this one was the one where Christian Bale and his partner Taye Diggs, who's played by Taye Diggs, where they are sparring with each other, because that's, I mean, it's an old trope, but at least that fight scene means something. They're trying to convey information through the steps and hits that each character gets. It's an old trope. It's used a lot, but at least it has meaning.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fight scene that's not about the fight scene. It's about one character trying to test another character's loyalty.
Yeah, and I feel
I feel
like a good fight scene should have like motivation behind it. Now, I'll be the first to admit, like a climax where it's finally like villains' ideals versus heroes' ideals, and all they can't come to a consensus, so they have to fight it out. I'll be the first to admit that I'm all down for those kinds of action sequences. They work, but there's also meaning behind that. There should be meaning behind it. It's like, we can't come to a consensus. You think this way, I think this way. The only way for us to finish this is by one of us leaves this room and the other one doesn't, which makes it meaningful. It means like we're at the conclusion of this is what the hero has been working towards, depending on how great that climax is in terms of the story. I don't think this movie quite gets to that point in terms of its action sequence. I felt like the setup between John Preston and Taye Diggs' character, their Brant, sort of Cleric Brant, their sort of like final conclusion was short-lived and dumb. He just like cuts him open, and you're like, okay, fine. But then what was the setup with all the sparring? What was the point of that? And the fight scene with Father, I think, actually is pretty weak too.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's almost like someone's a fight choreographer was saying, "Oh, I want to do a fight scene where they like are trying to punch each other with guns."
I thought that was pretty slick, but it doesn't do anything for me.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. It lacks the emotional resonance, and so that's really, to me, I think ultimately why the movie falls flat is because it's flashy action, and I'll admit the flashy action is flashy. Is flashy, and and there's a certain appeal to it, but. I think it's interesting that you point out the whole question about violence, and they do hint at it. And it's interesting because as I thought about it more, this movie actually is, in my opinion, very brilliant, but not quite enough to be aware of the fact that it's brilliant, and so it doesn't quite land. Like, there's so many things actually, I think, already in there.
Oh, I know, but they're never talked about.
Exactly. Like, if you just, all they needed to do was just pick one thing and explore the greater ramifications of it, and it could have been really smart. So, for example, and I'll get into this in my pitch, but one thing that was right in there that I thought was actually, and I thought like, oh, this is actually really smart, was the whole idea of male masculinity and the inability to express emotion.
That's interesting. I didn't go down that route because I found another thing that was interesting.
So that's the thing. So in this case, if you think about it, they live in a world where they're not allowed to. They have to repress their feelings, and the way that then manifests itself is in violence. And I thought,
that's interesting.
I'm like, that's totally that. That's actually.
Oh my god, I didn't even think about that. And that's brilliant. And I don't want to keep going. I'll keep.
Well, if you think about it, that's actually in there, but it, for whatever reason, it just doesn't because the movie is so kind of incoherent, and the motivations don't quite land, and the character, I think it's also because the characters don't really interact with that. They don't come to any sort of recognition of that these ideas, they don't really seem to have any, they don't carry that emotional resonance, so it doesn't really come across. So you do have to kind of read into it a little bit. However, I do think it's there.
I would totally agree with you that it's there. There's only two female characters on screen. Three. There's three. There's John's wife, Emily Watson's character, and Lisa, John's daughter. Those are the three characters on screen, and only one of them is really given any lines or importance to the film, and she's still pretty superfluous.
Yeah,
which is Emily Watson's character.
Well, that was another thing that I mentioned. She just exists for plot and doesn't actually do anything to drive the story along, unfortunately. And then there's another thing that the world assumes that this will lead into another point. This idea of removing art
Oh, that's exactly what my point was. Because for
ahead.
me, it was they keep talking about we're going to remove art and we're going to like archive it or we're going to do something with it. But then it comes down to the question and I thought the movie was going to do this purposefully. And it never quite gets there, which is really disappointing because there's a scene where they're like, take all the art and deal with all the art, and then immediately they go back to the like main compound in the city, which I think is called Libris. They go back to the main compound in the city, and John is being interrogated by that head clergyman, and the camera pans across a statue of Atlas holding the world. And I'm like, how is that not art?
Yes, exactly.
So for me, I was like, oh, this movie is going to ask questions about like the actual nature of what art is. How do we define art? And then when he pulls the screen off of the window, when he's finally off Prosium, he pulls the screen off the window and he sees like the rain, and it looks beautiful to him. By the way, I did notice that for most of this movie, we get that grayscale kind of thing, but there are certain sections where John is feeling emotion, where that aesthetic, that visual aesthetic, is different. We get much warmer tones in the camera. So I actually think that was done purposefully because it's supposed to feel very, very what's the word I'm looking for? Not
sterile.
Sterile. Yes, thank you. So because it's supposed to feel that way, but when he feels emotion, it gets much warmer the way the camera looks. Specifically around when Emily Watson's character dies, we get much more feeling, and it's lit. The fire itself is lit much more warm because of the anger and passion and all that imagery around fire. My point here is like, what does art mean to each individual person? When John sees the rain falling, he is experiencing beauty, and beauty is totally subjective. Nature is beautiful, art is beautiful. Architecture, brutalist architecture, is a kind of art.
Yes, exactly.
And so they should be living in nothing, but you can't do that because anything could be art. So it comes down to like, and that's what I get into on my pitch. My pitch is the same kind of idea about what art is and what art isn't and why. But yeah, I just found that one like, what do you mean by art? I thought that your reading of masculinity is holy shit. That's awesome.
Well, it was because I actually thought that's where, even if it wasn't going there, I was like, oh, that's totally in there. But going back to art for a second, because that was another thing I was thinking of too. The idea is like, okay, well, how is like architecture not like, there's an aesthetic to that too. You can't like remove aesthetic. Like the aesthetic property of something is just an innate quality that anything possesses. And so I thought also like, oh, okay. Well, they've sort of banned a certain kind of art. They've banned something that's about like expression. Because whenever he plays Beethoven, like from Romantic era, which was all about like expression and feeling.
Yeah, romance particularly was very.
So I thought, and then at the end when he's in Father's like abode or whatever, there's paintings everywhere, and they are like of a former century that are much more lavish and expressive. And I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be the moment where Father's like, okay, I have to be like, admit this is what's really going on, and we were going to have like the veil pulled back.
The veil pulled back, which is what I did in my pitch, where you go like, oh shit, like
but. All he says, like he says, like, oh, I feel too.
Like, I'm alive. Like, you can't kill me, and he's just like, yeah, I can. You're like, you asked the question and didn't do anything with it.
I know, exactly. And I thought, well, and that was another point where I just went, well, that was interesting. Why would you just cancel this? Like, there was a really interesting direction to go there.
There's even a scene where John is rearranging stuff on his desk. And his partner, the cleric Brant, comes over and says like, oh, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm rearranging my desk. And he's like, are you redecorating? And he's like, no, I'm optimizing. And clearly the audience is supposed to know like he's lying. But to me, I was like, oh, because like the arrangement of a desk could be art. There's constantly hints about like, are we going to ask subjective questions about what art is and what art isn't? How does this work? And it never does that. We never talk about it. It's this movie is preoccupied with this idea of like, oh, feeling is the great reason why we're alive. And there was a time there where it was asking some questions where I was like, with Emily Watson's character, when he's like interrogating her, and she's like, you don't even know what it means to be alive. Like, why are you here? And I was like, these are existential questions, not necessarily like emotional questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Like any reason that he gives, as long as he believes it and isn't delusional about it, is an appropriate answer. But that's because I'm an absurdist.
Right.
Or an existentialist. So like, people say like, well, art is the reason, it gives us meaning to our existence. Well, yes, it certainly makes a sensual kind of feeling, but the reason you exist, like your purpose, if you want to get existential about it, is entirely what you make of it. From an absurdist standpoint.
Yeah, it's like a different sort of strand of thought that's sort of planted in there, but doesn't really connect to some of the other things.
I understood what they were trying to do, like the feeling that's what makes life worth living, kind of. But this idea, like, there are many people who don't get art.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Well, I think a lot of that is, because I made a note of that too, is there did seem to be this obsession in the 90s with finding ways to suggest that humans were not machines, and 90s, early 2000s, like science fiction, it's kind of this technophobia.
Except iRobot is kind of different, because in the end they basically wind up being the same.
Yeah, iRobot does actually do something a bit different with it. But you have The Matrix, you have Terminator. Again, Terminator does sort of ask something, because you have the Arnold Schwarzenegger in T2, who does seem to walk that line a little bit more. But in every case, the solution is, it's usually like, we have to preserve what makes us unique, and what makes us unique is that we feel. That's usually kind of what it boils down to. I mean, I am reducing it a lot, but I do feel these movies kind of reduce it a bit too. But I think a lot of that speaks to some kind of, I think it's a bit of technophobia, a bit of like a Y2K technophobia.
Yeah.
The other thing too, I also question the idea that like feeling is the thing that makes us uniquely human, because animals feel too. Like,
I think that people are always like, oh, but humans have like a broader range of emotions. I don't even know if that's true, mostly because I'm not a biologist or like an animal behaviorist. But like, I know for a fact that elephants are extremely intelligent and have a broad emotional range, and understand concepts like revenge, which I think is largely feeling motivated.
Yeah, I would think so too. Yeah, and all their other animals like dolphins apparently actually like appreciate certain music and react to certain music.
Yeah, other than just as a stimuli.
Yeah, exactly. Like dolphins also do seem to engage in behavior. Like there's also videos of dolphins basically, those like pufferfish, that like spiky ones?
Yeah, they'll play with
dolphins and they'll get high off of them.
Yeah.
Like these are things that animals do just for their own amusement, right? So this idea that like, oh, we have to do, like, we are a unique species in that sense, I also question that notion. So whenever it comes up in a movie, like I understand like this is the argument they're trying to make, but it's just another thing where I'm like, yeah, but I think it's more nuanced than this. Yeah.
I think we try to make those distinctions. Yeah. The other thing that I focused on maybe more than the male masculinity, which I think I can't believe I missed that. That's such a great thing. I also focused a lot on like the structures, power structures.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's like Nazi symbolism and the fascism, but
right.
I think the system around with like how the structure of society works, I think would have been more interesting to look at. Especially like around the idea of like who controls what art is and what isn't art, and who can have art and who can't. Because I think that has less to do with like feeling and emotion. That has less to do with definitions of what art is, and has more to do actually with power structures. Like who decides as opposed to what is or isn't. Because we already went over that, how that's subjective. But I think exploring the idea of like, actually, well, hang on a second, it isn't about what is or isn't art, or about sense and feeling. It's actually all about control. Who controls what and how and why.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually where I thought it was going at the end.
Me too.
I thought that would have been a really interesting movie, because that's definitely and that's, again, like, that's an idea that's somewhat baked in there, but they just don't really follow through with it. And so that's the thing. It's like, if you look at it, you go, oh, there's a lot of, like, that's why I said, like, this movie is actually very brilliant, but doesn't realize it. And because it doesn't realize it, it ends up being this just flashy action movie. And
It's actually kind of disappointing, because I did enjoy my time with this movie.
I did too. I didn't skip it. I actually did not skip through this one.
I watched the whole thing front to back. I enjoyed the acting. I actually thought some people might say the acting is kind of flat, but I think that's actually the point, especially at the beginning.
I think it worked really well. I actually thought the acting was good. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's supposed to be, like, almost no emotion. Especially, I noticed that when Taye Diggs, whenever he smiles in this movie, it feels inauthentic.
Yeah, I was trying to figure that out too. I was like, well, wait, is he feeling? Because I thought that was a nice little touch as well. Like, there's some really great, and Emily Watson as well. Like, she gives a good performance. Like, there isn't from a, like, filmmaking perspective, like, everyone's hitting their marks, saying their lines well. It's in focus. It looks good.
It looks good. The problem with this movie is, I think it's either didn't understand what its themes were enough to follow through, or it didn't know what its themes were, or they just wanted to have a flashy ending. I sometimes I wonder too, where when they were in the filming process or in the writing process, they were just like, well, we need a flashy ending. It's got to be a good ending.
Yeah, because the ending does feel like all right, we had a third act, but we're going to cancel the third act and just have this, like, denouement where it's, the proletariat rise up and Christian Bale's going to feel emotion and have a tear.
And he's going to fly off into the air while raging.
Oh yeah, he's going to Superman while raging.
Yeah,
I know. It's like stuff like that. Where
that's what it feels like to me. It feels like they were trying to do the Matrix at the end, except to me, it didn't earn it the way the Matrix did. No,
exactly. And because the other thing too that I think, like, I mean, whenever this idea of, like, the resistance rising up and taking over, it's always played as a, like, yes, and it's the end, we've won. But then there's always the question of, like, okay, but so you've just replaced one power structure with another power structure. How is that going to go?
Yeah, what's your power structure going to look like? What is that going to look like? How is that going to function? I also think it's often interesting. They talk about, like, what's the difference between a coup d'etat and an insurrection, and it's literally whether or not they succeed.
Right.
And
that's actually a good point.
It's very, very interesting way to think about it, because an insurrection is seen as a bad thing, but a coup d'etat is seen as, like, not necessarily a good thing, but just a change.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I usually associate a coup d'etat with the military. It's usually a military.
Military.
But it's I think by force,
It's this idea of, like, rebels versus terrorists, right? Depending on, like, whose side you look at. And so I think the act of, like, a rebellion uprising, even in the name of humanity, is a particularly destructive activity. And you say, like, well, that's where the movie ends, that's where the story ends. And I certainly think there are stories that are about insurrections and uprisings, and but I think it's actually interesting to ask, like, how much of your rebellion or uprising, whether it be motivated by good reasons or not, how much of that is actually more destructive than good?
Exactly. And I think that's another thing too that I always question whenever they show us, like, this resistance, and the resistance is, like, unquestionably a force for good. I'm always like, bullshit.
Is it though?
There's
hang on a second.
You can't assume that this, like, okay, I'm all for throwing out the status quo just as the next guy, and toppling despotic dictatorships. Fine by me. But let's not assume that the organizations that are doing this are, like, perfect and flawless.
Perfect and benevolent,
and altruistic. Exactly.
They also want to put their own power structures in place, and oftentimes the central motivation for why they're uprising against your tyrannical, authoritarian government is because of one piece of information. So if I use this movie as an example, it would be like, well, the not being able to feel seems to be the central motivator for the rebels. Like, they want to feel, they want to appreciate art. Fuck, if I was going to be a despotic rebellious leader, I'd just be like, yeah, we want to bring back the emotion, and then build your platform on that until you are in power, and then be like, I brought you feeling and emotion back. I'm now in power.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's the other thing too. It's like why is like violent overthrow the solution in this case?
I actually think, based on your idea of like this male masculinity coming out as violence, I actually think that the only way for John to win against that system is for him to be passive at the end, to somehow win over the system by not acting in violence and yet still winning or defeating his opponent in an act of non-violence.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I feel like, that actually would have been an interesting way to go with it. Again, if the movie was actually about that could have been explored more, and that could have been a direction that it would have gone.
But so my point with that is, I'm just saying, like, I don't think your reading is wrong. I think your interpretation of the movie, that reading is valid, and I actually, the more I think about it, the more I think that the evidence is there to back it up. I'm sad that I didn't think about it, but I'm saying, like, that would have been a way for him to break that cycle had the movie known or been going in that direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Cognizantly.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of why I say, like, a lot of these ideas are kind of, I feel that the reason it doesn't land, and the reason nobody's talking about it today as a movie about masculinity and how it expresses itself in violence, is because it's all kind of nullified by the ending.
Yeah.
And, and other problems with it too. Obviously, like, there's a lot of other issues with it that we've talked about, but
the children, I don't know really. I don't really know why John's children are in the movie. They don't do anything.
So, okay, well, this is another interesting thing, too. If you, like, I'm thinking about the research I did around the Khmer Rouge, what would happen was the Khmer Rouge would try to get the children, and you read about this in Nazi Germany, too, like the kids to rat out the parents. And I thought that, like, again, when we're talking, like, your idea of power structures and, like, despotic governments and total control, like, that's a fact of the way these regimes work. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. They could explore this. Like, kids are like...
That's interesting you bring that up, because Michel Foucault does this in Punishment. What the name?
Crime? Oh, not Crime and Punishment. Discipline and Punishment.
Discipline and Punishment. Yeah. He talks a lot about how society is set up as like kind of like Jeremy Bentham's panopticon.
Yes,
not physically, but like sort of metaphorically, where we all are sort of responsible for making sure that each other are staying within the lines of the law, and teaching children this kind of like I did a whole this is a thing on Thomas the Tank Engine and how children learn authority, or how children learn morality through, and often in shows it's done through authoritarian means, and not because children are like authoritarian, it's because children don't know any better, and so they need to get their morality from a system that seems infallible until they understand that nothing is infallible. They're just not there yet, right? So if you instill that into children at a young age, you can create sort of this perfect panopticon of society, not a physical panopticon, but a societal panopticon, and have everyone responsible for calling everyone else out, but particularly children. So it's interesting that you bring in the Khmer Rouge. That's very, like Foucault, those kinds of power structures. Even the idea of child soldiers, the fact that John's son is in the clergy. He's already becoming, or set to become, part of that institution, or is already part of that institution. The thing that didn't make sense to me there was that neither of them are on the proscenium, and John didn't notice.
Oh, right.
At the end, he's like, how long? And he's like, oh, since Mom. And Lisa? Oh, of course. And you're like, I don't understand why you're here. Like, I understood for the plot, like, it just doesn't do much for them to be there.
Oh, okay, yeah, exactly.
I actually think if you were going to justify having the children in the movie, I actually think having the kid rat John out would have actually justified their presence more.
Yeah. Exactly. And it actually would have spoke more to the world in which the characters inhabit. That it's like that would actually speak volumes about the fact, like, oh, like familial loyalty can now be like replaced by loyalty to this figure who calls himself father.
Father, right?
Yeah. So it's like, again, like, oh, there's another great thing that they could have, kind of explored.
Yeah.
And I agree, because I think the kids don't do anything to change the outcome of events.
No, and you can kind of see, if you watch the movie, you can kind of see neither of them are on the Prosium based on their reactions.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just reading into it, but there's a point where Lisa is like crunching her cereal, and she's and then you can see that the kid, I don't remember the little boy's name, but he's annoyed.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not a feeling he should have if he was on Prosium. And she smiles. She knows she's annoying him.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's so small, and they're not in the movie enough for it to matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I could be reading into that. I think that's how that scene plays out, but I could be reading into that.
I mean, I think I hadn't thought of that the first time I saw it, but now that you mention it, that makes sense. I actually think that is why they put the scene in there. But ultimately, because they don't really... them being there doesn't really seem to affect his decisions. It doesn't affect anything about how the story progresses. Yeah. Like, the movie, you could have taken them out and had pretty much the same
movie
story. Yeah.
The other structure, because you just brought it up, you talked about the character named Father. The thing that I thought they didn't do enough with in this movie was talk about sort of religious power structures as well.
Yeah, that was another thing.
They sort of present the Grammaton clergy as a religious, or as a governmental organization, without really breaking down that it's a religious organization. The person at the top is called Father, like a priest, and even the fact that they keep referring to the priest as Tetragrammaton. I looked this up because I didn't know what this meant, but Tetragrammaton refers to 4 letters, tetra and gramma, referring to like letter or grammar. Tetragrammaton, and what it is in Hebrew, there's 4 letters that are used to denote Yahweh.
Oh, okay.
So it's like YWHA, Yahweh, I think, something like that. I mean, that's the English translation of a Hebrew 4 letters, so it's obviously not exact. But the idea is that in for some Christians, but for Jewish sects and religions and peoples, they don't refer to God by his name. They always refer to him as like God or the Father or the Almighty. So this is like Adonai or Elohim or all of those kinds of things. My Lord, the God, or in English we use God or He, capital H. Those kinds of things, because they think that his name is so sacred. So one of the ways that they also refer to him is by saying the Tetragrammaton, those 4 letters. That's another way to refer. So, but that was something I had to read into, and the movie doesn't do anything with that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's very fascinating. Yeah. That's making me think of the movie Pi, which is basically somewhat about that. The whole idea of there's some characters who are trying to find the name of God.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Again, because I was trying to figure that out too, because they're called clerics. Yeah. They have the way they dress is very priestly. Yeah, exactly. Like, so there was clearly some kind of like reference being made to it, and I thought that was like some interesting world building. And again, the idea that he's called Father, there doesn't seem to be any mention of religion, but that does seem to have been replaced by some kind of religion.
Yeah.
What is that?
That seems strange to me, because they kept referring to it as like a branch of government, but never really referred to it as like a religious government.
Yeah.
Now maybe for them they wouldn't make the distinction, but at least as a viewer you'd think that you'd be like, okay, this is a religious authoritative state or oligarchy, or because of Father I would think it's much more of like a religious dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then again, like there is, like, it does seem to be secular, like in the sense that they seem to remove any kind of iconography. So
I guess, is that art? It's so hard to tell, because like Atlas would have been seen as like a religious figure, not in our day and age, but certainly like the totem or idol of Atlas had meaning, and still has meaning in terms of art, but had meaning in terms of its religious value to the ancient Greeks and Romans. So, why are we allowed to have statues of Atlas and then not talk about what art is art, but we've removed like sort of religious iconography? This goes even further. Again, the flag of Libris, of the city, is black and red and black, right? Which is clearly a reference to like Naziist colors, even the design of the flag. And you'd think if we're not allowed to have art, then the aesthetics of the flag wouldn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
This movie is smart, but it's not smart enough to know that it's smart, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's kind of what I'd say is going on. There's like we had a lot to talk about.
We could still go.
Yeah, like there's clearly a lot that's there. It just somehow, the way it's packaged, it doesn't quite coalesce into something that's really, it just doesn't have that punch to it.
And it's it's the narrative where it falls apart. We already mentioned John's two kids, but there's a scene where John frames Brandt because he switched the guns earlier in the scene, or earlier in the movie, and I was like, that's smart, that's clever. I didn't see that one coming. But then they undo it.
Yeah.
He like comes back and he's like, we actually used you to set this all up. And I was like, that's bad, because you've undone things that were good about this movie in order to have like a twist on a twist. And it doesn't work. It's not working for me, especially.
It becomes a little Rick and Morty, like that episode of Rick and Morty where it's like, but I knew you were gonna betray me,
what the heck is the name? It's the heist episode. I can't
remember. The heist one, yeah. It's like, I knew you were gonna backstab me.
So
like,
I backstabbed you, but I betrayed you because I knew you were gonna betray me betraying you. Yeah.
Yeah, it does get a little bit like that at the end, where
especially
it's like,
especially because
I knew you were gonna backstab me. But I had one up on you. But I had one up on you. One upping me. Ha.
Yeah, especially because Brandt has been so suspicious, and to watch him like think he set a trap for John, and then watch John like set his own trap. Is so satisfying. And then he gets dragged away, and you're like, well, that's all we'll ever see of that, and it feels good. And then to have him show up later is like, really? Like, really?
Yeah.
Why? And then the sword fight, because you're like, okay, well, maybe they're doing this to justify them having a sword fight because they set up them sparring earlier, only to have John basically cut the dude's face off in like 5 seconds.
5 seconds, yeah.
Which means like that wasn't even a justifiable way to set up a reprise of their sword fight. It's just bad writing.
Exactly. I was like, oh, this is gonna be like he's gonna have to like fight in, like to within inches of his life against this guy, and it was like, what? That was.
And then they do, but then they do like the gun fu fight with Father, and it's not as meaningful. Like, I know that it turns out Father's not real. He's just a figurehead. Fine, sure, whatever. That's nothing new for these kinds of
exactly. It's sort of like an archetypal twist. It's kind of necessary.
It's kind of necessary. But I actually think the fight between Taye Diggs would have been more meaningful because Father thought he was going to win and then doesn't. And at the end, he's like, well, I'm life, and like begs for his life. And instead, John is like, no. Yeah. Because that to me would have been like, oh, okay. Like John is now come to the conclusion, especially if they vocalize this, he's come to the conclusion that he's willing to kill for reasons, even if killing is wrong. So that other people don't have to. People like, I don't know, maybe his children, and bring them back into the plot. I'm just saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least bring them relevance. All right, we should get into pitches.
We should get into pitches, yeah.
I'm happy with mine, but I don't know where you're at with yours.
I'm happy with mine too. It doesn't matter to me.
Why don't I go first? I feel like I always go.
I went with the toxic masculinity.
Okay, that's a better idea than mine is. So I'm gonna do mine first.
Okay.
So my movie starts out the same way, but instead we get the voice of Father explaining what happened in the past. So in the wake of the Third World War, the city of Libris was created, and as all the other governments fell, the Catholic Church managed to like stay somewhat functioning, but it's not called the Catholic Church anymore. It was like a sect of the Catholic Church, like an extremist sect, but they managed to build a new religion from that sect and built this city, which is a neutral city amidst all this other warring country that's still happening. They managed to build a city with peace and neutrality, and the new religion is called the Grammaton clergy. And the city of Libris is founded in peace, and it's being governed by this Grammaton clergy. And it's now a religious oligarchy. Like it's clear to the audience this is a religious oligarchy, but they have managed to find some peace in a war-torn, I'm assuming, Europe.
Okay.
But the reason they've had so much success where other cities has failed is because the Grammaton clergy has introduced a drug called Prosium 2, which inhibits emotions. This has allowed the citizenry to live peacefully for about 60 years, and for systems of government to be formed effectively and put into place, whereas other cities have tried and they can't put them into place because people are so emotional or opinionated or whatnot. So no one's forced to take Prosium 2, but anyone who chooses not to take it must leave the city because the city needs to function, and that's the way they've decided. Nobody's forced to take it. You don't want to take it, that's fine, but you can't live in the city. And everything has to be based on logic and order and reason, and that's why if you don't take Prosium, you have to leave the city. But you're not forced to take it. It's a choice. So everyone who lives there wants to take it. Because of the lack of emotion, art is largely seen as useless, and so the Grammaton clergy rounds up all the pieces of art of various kinds, and they do archive them for educational purposes, because even though they don't feel like sensory emotion, there's still like there's a education, right? It's useful to have them to be like, what's the history, you know, the reason. It's all logic and reason. So we're but other than that, like, nobody really has art, and the Grammaton clergy basically says, like, you shouldn't own pieces of art because we don't want to give people the temptation to stop taking Prosium. So that's why we round them all up. So we're then introduced to John, who's a priest. He's a high-ranking member of the Grammaton clergy, who is part of a team that collects art and enforces the law libris regarding sense offense. He and his partner go out to find that there have been people collecting art on the outskirts of the city, and they round them up and detain them so that they can be taken back to the capital and be processed. This is where they're either relocated out of the city or introduced into this society and how to use Prosium, or rehabilitated into using Prosium. Their choice. The art is all archived, and if there's any like duplicates, that's all burned because we don't need duplicates. And so, but before the two of them can start burning, also this would be the two of them doing it. Like, it's their responsibility to archive it. It's not somebody else's. Like, that's the two of them do it.
Right.
So the two of them, before one of them can, or either of them can start burning some stuff, one of the dissidents attempts to stop them. And we can see that Errol and John are now trained in lethal force, and they kill the man, but they didn't want to. And by that, I mean, like, that's not really, there's no reason in aimlessly killing. There's no logic to it. They don't like to do it, and it's also a hassle because they're not supposed to kill people, and there's going to be paperwork, but there's no feeling behind it. It's just it's senseless violence, and even though they were defending themselves, and that's logical, they don't like to do it because it's not reasonable, right? There's no logic to it. So on the car ride back, Errol seems shaken at having, that's Errol, that's Sean Bean's character.
Okay, right.
He seems to be shaken at having to kill someone, which John registers. He also notices that Errol seems particularly attached to one of the books that they have taken that wasn't in the archive, and it's a book about poetry. So we can have the same scene of John catching Errol, but this time he's giving Errol the choice. He says, you can either leave the city, be rehabilitated, or you can die. And Errol responds, he says, life outside of the city is basically a death sentence anyway. You and I know this. Like, we've been outside of the city enough to know that it's just war and poverty out here. And living without feeling is basically like not living anyway. So he chooses to die. And John says, fine. And he grants Errol's wish, and he shoots him. And he reasons that, well, he was doing his friend a service. His friend didn't want to come back. So logically, he gave his friend what he wanted. So he doesn't feel it as an emotion. It doesn't register that way. Back at home, John reads a bedtime story to his children. It's a story that's kind of like devoid of any meaning.
Oh, okay.
And John is assigned a new partner named Cleric Brant. They're sent on another raid, but this one is much further out of the city, and it'll take like some time to get there, like a day. And during this time, we see the two of them interact, and it's clear to us, the audience, that Brant is like, he not a good person. Like, he doesn't feel anything, but whereas like John doesn't feel, Brant seems to like enjoy the lack. You can't really enjoy because that's a feeling, but he seems to like relish the idea of people not feeling things.
Oh, okay.
And like enforcing like sort of other people not to feel things. There's a kind of power play in it for him.
Oh, okay.
So John seems irritated during the raid because something doesn't add up about where they're going. And not a single person wants to go back to the city, but the order comes in that none of them should be allowed to leave, and they're not going to be taken back for processing. That they're just going to kill them. And John's like, well, I'm not going to kill them. That's senseless. There's no reason to that. But Brant kills all of them. So when they return home, John asks the higher clergy like why the order came through to kill them if they ran. That's not logical or reasonable. And the whole point of the Grammaton clergy is reason. But he's told that there is a reason, but he may not be aware of it due to his position in the clergy. And John's sort of like, well, that's not logical either.
Right.
So at home, John's daughter asks him to read the same bedtime story. And he's like, why do you want the same one? And she's sort of like, the words are strange. Like their order and their logic don't mean anything. Like they're kind of illogical, and that it's funny to her. Like it's in this funny kind of illogical way. Not a feeling way. And this time when he's reading the story, John also pays attention and he comes to see what she means. There's like a funny illogic to the words that is kind of like amusing.
Right.
In a non-feeling kind of way, like a non-logical. Right. So curious, he takes the book with him to work, and Brant sees this as odd, like he notices. But John says he's curious about the book, and he goes to the Grammaton archive and basically like asks the archive clergy there why this book was allowed, and like it's not logical. And the clergy, like, why would this book be allowed if it's illogical? And the clergy answers, he's like, the illogic of the book was considered not to be harmful, and due to its non-logic, it has no real meaning, and therefore doesn't matter. And John's like, but if it has no meaning, doesn't that make it art? Like, why would we keep it? That doesn't make sense.
Right.
If the words have no order or reason, like in terms of syntax or grammatical structure or function, then the purpose of having it is only art? I don't get it.
Right.
But it's an allowed book. And the Grammaton allowed it. So on a whim, he also asked the archive clergy about the perimeters of the city because he was curious about why they were sent so far away. And his schematics of the city that he has have not been updated. And so what he sees is that the archives the city's map archives are different from the ones that he has. The city in the archive is much bigger than the one he has, meaning that they changed it and his hasn't updated yet.
Okay.
And there was no mention of this change. So he's like, well, that's weird. Like there was a change in the city's limits. It got bigger. So Brant is still clearly suspicious of John. But when a call comes that they're going to do a huge raid, the two head out of town. John has the opportunity to kill some runaways, but he chooses not to. He wants to talk to them this time, rationally. He doesn't see as logical to kill them, even though the order was given. And as a Grammaton cleric, he's supposed to be against senseless violence. But Brant basically catches them, and we can get the scene where he like wants John to do the killing, but instead John gives the gun back.
Right.
Yeah, that whole scene. John goes to the High Council, which is like they convene in this very grandiose big room. And John asks them why they changed the city limits and why they changed the rules around killing. And they explain there's a plan to expand the city due to the population growth, and that they have they're slowly managing to clear out more and more of the surrounding area. But John's like, but they should have made this known to all citizens. That would have been reasonable. They all should have made it known to anyone living outside of the city so that they would leave the premises, because that would also have been transparent and reasonable. You can't kill people senselessly because they're in city lines and not expect them to know where the city lines are if you didn't tell them. Like that doesn't make any sense. But they're like, no, this is what we're doing, and that's the way that it is. And as he leaves, John sort of is like, it's curious that they need such a large and ornate room with such architecture, and that's not considered art. And they rebuke him by saying that the room is meant to signify how grandiose they are and solidify their position and importance, but they're clearly like suspicious. And John's like, that doesn't really add up. So John goes out of the city, and he finds and saves some people from being killed by other clergy using his gun. But it's actually Brant's gun, just so we're clear. Yeah.
Right.
So the dissidents by this time he like when he saves them, he sits down with them and he wants to warn them that there's something coming, because he's like, this is reasonable. You should know about this. Otherwise we're just killing you. And that's not okay. He also was like, I want to know a little bit more about why you guys would live such a way just for art. And one of them explains, they're basically like, you will never understand, as long as you're on Prozim, you'll never understand why we want to enjoy art. But what you can understand is that our actions around the meaning of art is similar to the way that you try to uphold reason and logic. We do the same kind of actions because we believe in that art and the meaning of art the same way you believe in the reason and logic. And John's like, that actually makes a lot of logical sense. I don't understand the motivation, but I can at least equate it to something. Yeah. So John actually finds this. That's pretty reasonable. And he's starting to suspect that the rest of the Grammaton clergy they're not interested in logic and reason anymore. And one of the rebels actually notices that John has a children's book in his pocket, that book that he read to his children. Mm-hmm. And he looks at it and he explains to John that this is poetry. And that's the reason it doesn't make sense logically, is because it's poetry. John couldn't understand it. So there really isn't a logic to the words. It's about the feeling that the words, and this is art. And John is like now confused. So they literally knew this was art. Or was it art? What is art, essentially?
Right. Interesting. Okay.
The rebels explain that art is anything. It's anything meaningful. It's nature. It's a sunset. Actually, one might even consider logic to be art in its simplicity and beauty. And John's like, whoa. And he's still on Prosium, by the way.
Right.
He's never stopped taking the Prosium. At that moment, Brant comes in, and the scene basically mirrors what happened with John. Like, Brant caught him. And it's supposed to mirror what happened when John caught Errol, Sean Bean's character.
Oh, okay.
Even John now knows he has a book of poetry, which is what Errol had at the beginning. Pardon me. So it's supposed to like directly mirror the exact same scene, but in this time, John decides that he wants to go back and be taken before the clergy council. But what he does is, this is all set up because he had they switched guns, and so it looks like Brant was the one who was saving the rebels, and that's how Brant gets taken away. Same thing happens. So John is now left alone in the room with the council, and he proceeds to shoot each one of them one by one. Just boom, boom. Okay. And they're like, this isn't logical. How could you do this? And he's like, you're letting emotion lead you. Like, none of this has ever been about logic. So I'm systematically removing you because that's the logical conclusion in order to regain peace and order. And the last one's left, and he says, no, actually, all of us are on Prosium. We've been on Prosium the whole time. We've been using Prosium as a way to, like, what we've essentially been doing is gathering art and archiving it, but we're not really archiving it. We're actually selling it to other countries in order to fund our own.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
In order to fund our own, like, expanse of the city, and basically to move the religion into other countries without them knowing it. But we're using that art has value. It just doesn't have artistic value. It has a monetary value that we can sell to people.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And this isn't because, like, they explain, like, they do this because they have the power to do so, and they basically fed the idea that passion and emotion is what fuels war, but it's not. We can do this because war has far more to do with structure and power and who wants to go to war for what monetary means. It has very little to do with whether people feel like they should go to war or not.
Yeah, exactly.
So all of them have been on Prosium. Everyone in the city has been on Prosium, including John. And John realizes, he basically, he's going to kill them all, and he kills the last member, and the last member is like, it won't matter. So John shoots him and leaves, and slowly people stop taking Prosium as word travels that the council was messed up, and a new council is put in place. But because the systems of government were so strong while everyone was on Prosium and wanted to believe that they were doing the right thing, this has created a bland kind of peace, but people let it happen, and now those systems of government that are in place are so strong because people just let them happen, and John watches as nothing changes, and people now people are acting rationally and emotionally, and nothing changes.
Huh.
Yeah.
Huh.
Kind of dark, but...
Yeah. I liked, the whole thing with poetry being what he's reading his children, and then them saying, like, oh, well, logic is a kind of an art, too.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
it is.
Yeah, actually, yeah, it is. So
there's a simplicity and a beauty to mathematics. Mm-hmm. And when you put mathematics into different situations, you can get, like, fractals, and fractals can be interpreted in many different ways. Mountain ranges, plants, spirals, sunsets, those are all mathematical.
Yeah, and I also liked the idea that it was this that it was the Catholic Church that had taken over and was essentially removing art. There's something that's kind of like, there's a bit of a historical critique there too, with how like this like Puritan era, well, that was Protestant, but like how different sects within history have like said, no, this is like okay and this is not okay
and this is not okay.
Like it's a censorship.
Penises are not okay except if they're on the ceiling and they're Jesus's.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can basically what that tells me is that it's okay to show Jesus's penis, but only if it's on a ceiling. So if you want to have penises in your art, just paint them on ceilings.
Just paint them on ceilings. Just get the church to approve it and pay for it.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Otherwise, it's not okay.
Yeah,
it's crude.
Yeah, I know exactly. No,
crude. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
it's like Zardoz. That like gun good. Or no, is it gun good, penis bad?
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so in mine, it's the difference is that they live in a society where explicitly men are not allowed to express emotion.
Ah.
So, and they are actually given a drug that helps them suppress emotion. And the reason for this is because they are in a militaristic society that's at war. And it's a very paternalistic society, and basically the value of the society is that like they have to project strength in order to maintain basically like their safety.
Yeah.
And basically they've basically presented themselves, we are actually like the saviors of humanity. And what happened was years ago, humanity, you could interpret this as like an unofficial sequel to my iRobot pitch.
Oh.
Where at the end of iRobot, remember at the end of if I would have pitched iRobot, the machines won basically. And we're like, we're doing this for your own protection.
And they were going to kill all the humans.
Well, so in this version, the humans are kept alive. There's this great event that happened called the Great Automation. And what happened was humanity was headed for extinction, and this very rich billionaire created a machine that was going to preserve humanity. And basically this machine basically controlled everything. But the idea that I'm sort of trying to hint at is it was created by a man, and it's actually a very paternalistic thing, and so it's called father, and it's what's making all the decisions, and it's basically saying like, okay, well, there are other societies now that have run amok, and we have to basically we have to protect ourselves, and the way that we do this is by projecting strength. So now the only thing, so men in this society have to project strength, can't express emotions, and so they take this drug that allows them to do that. There's one side effect, however, and that is that they can't get a boner.
Those poor people.
So what they do is if couples want to have children, they basically go to father, and father approves of them to have children, and they go in isolation, and the man goes off this drug for a certain period of time. And what happens in these cases, nobody talks about it, but the men just start basically feeling everything and unloading it onto their spouse or partner.
Oh, wow.
And so basically so that's the only case where the male characters actually are able to,
I feel like in vitro is probably a better way to do that.
Yeah. Anyway, so, but the thing is nobody talks about it, because the thing is they go into these isolation, and so they're because men aren't able to express emotion, and they're done in secret. This happens in secret. Nobody actually feels safe talking about it. Anyway, so one day, so Preston comes home from work, and he's clearly something's off. And Mary, so in my version, Mary, who's played by Emily Watson, they're actually a couple in this one. So it's Preston and Mary, and she notices that something is off about Preston today, and she asks do you want to talk about it? He's like, no, I don't want to talk about it. But all you need to know is that my partner, he betrayed us today, and I had to kill him. I had to basically order his execution. Anyway, so, and he's disappointed, and then there's another scene where he goes to they have these check-in things where they go to a psychologist who basically is oh, okay, like tell me like how you felt, and he basically there's like I'm playing off this thing that you see a lot in totalitarian societies, where in early stages they had a lot of like confessions, like people like confessing like their sins essentially. And so he basically is like, oh, I was like, when I ordered the execution, I felt angry, and I actually expressed a little bit of anger, and I shouldn't have. And the guy's like, oh, it's okay. Like, if you express a little bit of anger, like, that's okay. It's just you can't show any weakness. Anger actually shows that you're actually strong, but you just can't show anything, like, you're not sad. He's like, no, I'm not. Like, I mean, he's like, I maybe feel upset, but I'm not going to show it. I'm not going to show that. He's like, okay, that's fine. So then he's allowed to continue practicing, and he gets a new partner, and this is Brandt. And they actually seem to get along quite well. So in this, it's not like the characters can't, like they do, they're a little bit more jovial maybe, but they can't express too much like affection, or they can't express too much admiration for somebody else. They've always got to downplay it. Anyway, somewhere in here, Preston discovers that his wife, Mary, actually has contacts in the Resistance. And she's actually been very recently sneaking out and meeting with people from the Resistance. And he catches her one day. And the reason he catches her is because she's been switching out his drug with a placebo.
Dun dun dun.
And so one day he wakes up and he's crying. He's actually grieving over the fact that he like ordered the execution of his partner, who was like his best friend.
Yeah.
And so but he basically he's like, no, like I shouldn't be crying. Like, I should be strong enough to feel this. I should be strong enough to be able to control these emotions. Why am I feeling these emotions? Anyway, and this is where he figures out that she like switched out the serum on him. And then she's like, look, I did this because I want you to know that like it's okay for you to like feel things around me. I'm not going to rat you out. In fact, like, think about the society we live in. Like, do you really want this? And she starts telling him about like what the Resistance is, and what the Resistance basically is they're like, we just don't like the fact that there's a machine telling us how to live our lives. Mm-hmm. There was a time where our ancestors were free. They could do things freely. They weren't assigned careers. They weren't assigned positions in societies. They could do things of their own free choice. And they want to basically like, and the only way they're going to be able to actually change the society is basically by destroying the central computer. And so she tells him, this is what we're going to do. And he's like, no, like, why would you do that? This is how we're going to keep everybody safe. This is how we're going to keep society safe. We need this. We need father, because if without it, civilization's going to destroy itself. That's why we needed this central computer. So then there's this awkward period where basically like he knows she's working with the Resistance, but he doesn't want to rat her out. And during this time, he's doing missions with Brandt, and basically their job is to find these dissidents, basically, right? And so they're getting closer and closer to the Resistance, and they're getting closer together. And so you get the sense here that Brandt and Preston have developed a bit of a friendship. Now, during this time, Mary's going and meeting with people from the Resistance, and someone in the Resistance, but she hasn't told the Resistance that she's told Preston yet. Yeah. And someone in the Resistance finds this out, and they're like, we can't trust her. If her husband knows about us, then he's going to find us and he's going to kill all of us. So they're like, we have to get rid of her. Like, we have to kill her. Yeah. Otherwise she's going to let them know. Now, before they're able to do anything, she's actually caught by one of the other clerics. And so now we have a scene where she's actually brought in, and Preston's now interrogated. He's like, and it's Brandt interrogating him, and he's like, why didn't you know that your wife was in the Resistance? And Preston is adamant that he did not know that his wife was in the, but the way this interrogation is conducted is Brandt is trying to get him to like slip up. He's trying to provoke a response. Yeah. And Preston is, and so the whole thing is, it's like him trying to like to repress these this feeling of like he's sad that his wife's being caught, and now he's like being interrogated. Anyway, so Mary is now taken and she's held as a prisoner in this big high security prison, and they're basically like torturing her for information. But Preston is not allowed to visit her because they're afraid that if he visit her, that's going to compromise him. So, but he still has to use the information that they're giving to help find the resistance. So he goes, and they go to find the resistance, and what it turns out is that they actually they found the resistance, and the operation gets botched, and Preston gets captured, and now he's being held hostage by the resistance. And they basically say, like, they give him the whole spiel of like, look, everything that you've been told about like the society you live in is not true. Like, we are actually not at war. Like, we have armies, but the other armies, like, we are basically like this nation that is just completely taking over places and forcing them to conform, and it's just destroying cultures and destroying other civilizations. And we think that this is like counterintuitive to what we are actually trying to do. What, like, we were trying to, like, the whole thing with this machine was we were trying to create peace, but now it's just a total totalitarian machine.
Yeah.
So anyway, Preston's like, okay, look, I'll help you as long as you can help me like rescue my wife. Like, that's what Matt. He's like, I want to like protect my family. That's what's like most important to me. So he agrees to help them. So basically, I think storming of the Bastille. Like, he basically like helps them infiltrate this prison so that they can storm the prison. However, in their attempt to do it, what they find out was this was where there was a double cross, and Preston was actually like, they planned for Preston to get caught by the resistance because they knew that he would help them let the resistance fighters in, and now they could trap them, and then they've caught the resistance this way. So now Preston is captured essentially, and at the very end, he's now being interrogated, and Brant's the one that's interrogating me. He's like, look, if the resistance had won, it would have been catastrophic. They keep talking about like freedom. There was a time when people were free. People were never free. Like, people always had a master, whether it was landlords, whether it was corporations, whether it was dictators. These people, these resistance people, they're like, no one was ever free. And technically, yes, so we're not free now, but at least like the problem was before the planet was headed to destruction. Different masters went to war with each other and tried to destroy each other, and actually almost brought the human species to extinction. This is the only way we can ensure survival, is if we have Father who is dictating this to us, and this is the way it has to be, and we just have to obey. And if we don't, if we're not able to do so, then that can compromise society. So basically, he has to then sign Preston's execution order. So he basically signs Preston's execution order. Then at the end of the movie, it's him. He goes home, and as he's leaving Preston, he's like, I thought we were going to be close. I'm really disappointed. So he goes home and he's upset, and he's noticeably upset. And his wife is like, hey,
oh man,
I notice, like, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? He's like, no, I don't want to talk about it. And that's where the movie ends.
Wow. So it's like cycles of violence continue.
Yeah. And the way I would do it in mine, is the violence would actually be like very uncomfortable to watch. So the idea is like, it's these guys, like, no one can express emotion, but when they're in these scenes where they got to go at it with each other, they get angry and they get violent, and they're rewarded for it.
It might be interesting also, just because to show how, because the men, like, as partners, like both Errol and John Preston, and then Brant and John Preston, to show them having like not explicitly homosexual relationships, but like as they build friendships, to like show that in like sort of male pseudo homosexual ways, to show that they like can't express their masculinity or their friendship in any other way other than like a physical kind of relationship with one another.
Yeah,
I'm thinking,
exactly.
You ever seen in in the Predator, the classic scene in the Predator when what's his name? Arnold Schwarzenegger and the other guy, they like clasp hands and they like, and it's like they're like beefy muscles, and you're like, there's something kind of like not explicitly homosexual but kind of homoerotic about this relationship between these,
definitely.
but they're not like, it always has to be masculine and macho. They can't say like, hey, I'm really glad you're my friend, you know what I mean? It has to be like, oh yeah, you got him, yeah, let's, you know, flex biceps and bump chests, and it's not, like I said, it's not really homosexual, but it's like pseudo physical in this masculine sense, because they're so they clearly care for each other, but they can't express it in emotional terms, and so you get this kind of weird eroticism, not maybe overt or sexually erotic, but you know, intimate in this weird kind of physical way.
There's a scene in what movie is it?
Top Gun is another one that does that.
There's actually so many movies where you see this, basically. Yeah, exactly. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I agree. Actually, that is the way I would approach it. Is something to that effect, where it's like, it's this very almost like bro-y attitude they have to adopt, but it's kind of like, but again, it's not like emotionally expressive, but it's physically expressive, and that's the world in which the characters inhabit. And so when Mary is asking him, like, do you really want this? Like, do you really want to live in this world? And he's like, he basically goes like, no, I have to, because I am its protector. So the reason, like, for him, it's like, no, this is like my position. My ability to ensure my stake in society is actually contingent on this. I have to uphold this in order for me to offer value. And she's like, no, you don't.
It's interesting that it's kind of like self-contingent. Like, in order for society to continue, he has to uphold it, and in order for him to have purpose in society, and for society to continue, he has to uphold it.
Yeah, exactly.
He has to continue, because if he stops upholding society, he has no place in it.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I thought it was like important to include the other, trying to get at least one other female character in there who could be like, who could just basically go like, well, no, think about what you're doing, and then she also try to like change him, try to get him to recognize like, no, this world in which you exist is not helpful. It's not healthy. In fact, it's destructive. I
also wonder like about the female to male kind of relationships that you'd build in there. Like, just from a narrative standpoint, you clearly have like feeling female versus masculine male. Like, it'd be interesting to have some characters, like minor characters, maybe that flip those on their heads.
Yeah, exactly. If I was to take another pass at it, that's what I would try to include, because the idea is basically like, okay, so we're basically playing with very hyper like defined tropes in terms of like gender. So one is like, and so the idea would be actually to try and blur those a little bit and go and actually have Mary, because Mary actually taking charge, essentially, like something that's,
which is
traditionally
masculine side,
masculine trait. I'm doing that in air quotes for those of you who can't see me doing
the Lacanian sexuation of what is male and female.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think for it to really work, you'd have to then ask that question too, where it's like, because otherwise you end up with a movie where it's just, she's just sensitive and he's just masculine.
Yeah, it's just masculine and feminine.
But the idea would be to actually flip that around and have her say like, no, I'm not, like, this is stupid. And
I'm
this
taking
isn't helping anybody. Yeah, exactly.
And then it might be even funnier to show a scene where the reason Preston can't let go of society personally, not from like an ideological standpoint of the society itself, but for him personally, ideologically, the reason he can't do it is because he's so vulnerable. Like, he's so sensitive to the idea of meaninglessness that he becomes I don't want to say like that's a feminine trait and therefore lesser, but like his insecurity, his feeling of insecurity, which is seen as a female trait, is why he's not able to move forward. And Emily Watson's character is showing this sort of masculine control, even though she's the female, sensual character. That would be an interesting way to show that.
Yeah, exactly. And like other things too, like I pictured the leader of the resistance to be a female character.
Yeah.
But there are other male characters that are there who are basically saying, who are, more, let's say, comfortable in their masculinity, and they're able to express themselves more. What?
I was just thinking, you had father as the machine in this one, right? Mm-hmm. But I wonder, because in iRobot, the name of the computer was Vicky.
Yes. Yeah. So
and what if you had a female?
Yeah. So it could be that too, because you could do it either way. Yeah. The reason I did father is because I thought it just made more sense for it to be like a very masculine, explicit, like patriarchal society. But the whole idea of it was like the society is built up around like the male protector. And so I thought, oh, okay, so that's sort of what they've put up on a pedestal. And the whole idea is them kind of going, well, the character's going, oh, wait a minute, that's not actually, this whole idea of like the male protector is actually
bogus,
bad, and actually counterproductive, because it's actually more destructive.
Yeah, well, I just wonder, like, if you had Vicky and had, so like, just like, you have this idea of the male protector, but then in every situation that you show in the movie, everyone who's in charge is female or read as female, because Vicky.
Yeah,
that'd be interesting.
That'd be interesting
because then it's
too.
Sort of like the narrative is telling you one thing, but then thematically and visually, you're not getting that.
Oh, that's I like that idea too. Yeah, I'm glad we had this conversation, because I don't feel like quite had the structure of the story figured out, but these are all the ideas that I feel like
it works. It's just
what I was trying to like feed into it were those kind of things where I feel like in the movie Equilibrium, a lot of that's kind of there.
It's there.
You just needed to like tweak it a little bit, and you could have really, because I thought just the idea of like, oh, living in a world, like make it explicit, like in this society, men are not allowed to express emotion. And then you think about the world we live in, well, it's really much frowned upon. There is something kind of dystopian about that.
Yeah, you're just taking that to the nth degree. But I even think about the idea of like being an active versus passive voice. Things happen to Emily Watson, whereas John makes things happen. All the male characters make things happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Lisa's decision to not take that's his Christian Bale's character's child. Her decision not to take the Prosium is actually told to the audience by her male sibling.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's baked in. That's really. Oh man. I think the issue there is I understood what you were trying to say with all this, but when you write a pitch, it usually only takes us an hour to write the pitch, and then you're just sort of coming up with an idea on the spot. It's not like a fully orchestrated draft.
No, exactly. Like there's obviously going to be flaws with it too, but the idea that we're always trying to do is to like go, okay, well, what was the thing that like, if they'd just taken another pass at it, what's the central thing they could have explored more?
Yeah,
and in this case, it's like there's clearly something right there. There's
like many things there. I went with art and with power structures, and you went with like masculine versus feminine and emotionality, and still power structures.
So. Yeah, well, because I feel like they're tied together. But I think the thing is, like, the more we do this, the more we kind of do episodes of this, the one thing I'm realizing is, like, I think where movies tend to do a little better is if they, like, have actually really tried to explore an idea in a more nuanced way, and have really tried to like the implications of that for the character, for the world in which those characters inhabit. If a movie's really able to do that, it tends to stand on its own a little better. And
they don't even have to be complex themes. Like we've looked at and we've talked about movies that are, children's movies where, we did A Bug's Life and compared it to Toy Story. And we talked about like how excellent Toy Story is at explaining themes of existentialism and purpose and lots of many other things. And we keep, we come back to, this is the reason why. Or I'll bring up my favorite, when I pitched Brave. All I did was change one thing. I introduced one character.
Yeah,
and that changed the entire frame of the movie to explore much more about what Merida's relationship with her parents was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, But it's always fun to kind of think about what's just the one thing that there's like, it's, and in many cases it's like, oh, it's right there. There's something that's right there. They just kind of walked through that door and said, okay, well, what would this mean to the character? What would this mean to the world they inhabit? What would this mean to the relationships between the characters? That just makes, those are the questions I'm starting to ask now when I approach stuff, because it's like, that's the stuff where I think that's where like classic literature, like that's where it really thrives. Is when
I think those are my favorite pitches that we do. The movies we talk about, when you're like, this is a good movie that could have been a great movie if just this one thing or one thing. And this is another one. I wasn't really expecting to super enjoy this film. I watched it the whole way through, but talking through it now, both of us, I think, are like, this is a really smart film that just isn't quite there.
Yeah, I know. It's the kind of thing where it's like, I feel like if it ever comes up in conversation, let's suppose that in 10 years from now, when we're allowed to have parties again, and I'm at a party and I'm in the corner, sipping on, I don't know,
your beverage
margarita.
of choice.
I'll pick a margarita. Why not? I'm feeling in the mood for a margarita. And someone's like, hey, remember that movie with Christian Bale? Was it called Equilibrium? I'll be like, hey, you know what? That movie's actually brilliant, and here's why. But
here's why.
Then it's also, exactly. Yeah. Because I actually think it's as I was
smart.
I was like, there is something right there.
Except for the climax. That climax is so dumb.
Just the way, it's kind of nullified by the ending. But anyway, I don't know. I feel like I've said everything I have to say about Equilibrium.
That's Equilibrium. Where can people find you?
Just go to my website, www.nathanieldraper.com, or letterboxed at DraperNate.
You can find my band Robot Philosopher anywhere you listen to dope music. You can also catch that on Instagram. You can find more narrative and, like, I guess, scripted content over on the CineMasters channel. And you can find lots more episodes of the CineCasters podcast and our classic podcast right here. Thanks so much for chilling with us.
Yeah, that was fun.
That was a good one.
Take care.
Peace.